Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is Roger Gilbert, and I'm in the Rongo Live video studio this afternoon reporting for Milling and Grain magazine. It's a pleasure to have with us today somebody who is familiar with sustainability and the impact it might have on our industry, and that is David Nickell. He's the Vice President of Sustainability and Business Solutions at DSM Animal Nutrition and Health. David, welcome to Rongo Live.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Pleasure to be here.
Well, David, it's very interesting to have you on the program, given that earlier this month we had the COP26 meeting here in Glasgow, in Scotland, actually, and the outcome of that. But before we get into that specifically, I understand from a sustainability response, DSM has introduced an initiative called We Make It Possible. Can you give me a quick recap on what that is in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Roger. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so for DSM, sustainability is really our DNA. It's who we are as a company. Very much a purpose-led company. We have been that for many years, doing well by doing good. And we translate that into our We Make It Possible strategic initiative. We're focused very much around 6 key platforms, which help the transformation of the animal protein business to a more sustainable footing. And basically, to summarize, we focus on, as I said, 6 key areas. One is about helping to tackle antimicrobial resistance, so the big societal issue of the rise of antimicrobial resistance, helping the industry transform itself and shift away from antibiotic use or limit its use and use of alternative technologies. Secondly, we look at reducing our reliance on marine resources. That's a big topic for aquaculture, of course. Aquaculture is for many, it's a primary protein source, animal protein source for many in the world. But of course, there's an over-reliance on marine ingredients in many cases. And so, again, developing technologies to help that transition to a more sustainable future. That's the basis of our joint venture with Evonik, for example, our Veramaris business that we've developed. And also why we venture in, for example, areas of single-cell protein with companies like Deep Branch. Thirdly, we look at making efficient use of natural resources. It's very much about getting more out of less. I think we're all aware of the need to use more local raw materials in our feed, the feed which is going into feeding animals, of course. There's big debate about land use change, the use of over-reliance on things like soy and corn and what have you. And so we've invested over the last 20 years in, for example, a feed enzyme business, and developing everything from xylanases, phytases, through to proteases, where you can extract more nutritional value out of raw materials. Really important, of course. Fourth, of course, we look at reducing livestock emissions. You would have heard a lot about developments we've made reducing methane emissions from ruminants. I was talked a lot about COP26. We can talk more about that later. But it's not just about methane reduction from ruminants. It's also reducing, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus emissions flows into the environment. These are kind of key drivers of biodiversity change on land and in water, and therefore how we're developing solutions to reduce the amount of nitrogen flow. So how do you get to a low protein diet, get more out of the protein that we're putting in the diet of the animal, reduce the amount of nitrogen going to the environment. Really important in many parts of the world, as you're fully aware, Roger. The fifth area is about reducing the loss and waste in the system, actually. So there's a lot of animal protein that is produced is lost. 20% of meat is thrown away, 35% of seafood. So how do you improve that? That's again looking at bringing nutrition, good nutrition into the feeding of animals, improving the inherent quality of the animal protein itself, extending the shelf life and what have you. And last but not least, it's the lifetime performance of animals on farm, particularly when you talk about areas like dairy nutrition, keeping the cow on the farm longer, making the animal much more productive, etc. And so, complete programs in terms of a much more productive farming system. And what's really important, what we notice is that, the footprint of animal protein, about 80%, up to 80% of the footprint of animal protein is due to the nutrition. Okay, so this is the crops coming off the field, the use in the animal, in the feed itself, and how the animal then uses that feed, turns that into protein, and of course the manure coming out of the animal. If you're not addressing that through nutrition, through bringing functional nutrition to get more out of less and be much more efficient and productive in the system, then you're really not going to make a difference. So that's where we focus. That's where we have our competence, and that's really the essence of our program. We make it possible.
Well, that's quite a comprehensive overview, and what springs out at me is that this is not just a sector or segment by segment approach to sustainability. It encompasses the whole of the protein food chain, as it were, from growing the crops for the animals through to not wasting that end cut of beef or whatever it is you're consuming. So how do you get that message across? I mean, do you have to break it up into segments, or are you promoting the global approach?
Of course, it's highly nuanced depending on where you are in the world, which species and value chain that you're operating within. For DSM, we actually operate from farming, the animal farming, all the way through to the human nutrition side of the business. So we're a completely integrated player along the value chain.
Yep.
So we're talking with the farming groups all the way through to the CPG companies, the consumer packaged goods companies and the retailers, etc., etc. And what you're noticing, particularly with the whole drive to decarbonisation of value chains, is you get down the value chain, to the big companies, and they're looking up towards the farming, their supply chain, and looking for solutions. So they want to see the complete kind of solution, not just a one product, one fit kind of approach. You need to take an ecosystem approach. You need to understand the consequential impact of the technologies you bring to the customer. You have to help them transition to their target reductions. So, for example, if you look at the dairy industry, as you probably would have read, the global dairy platform, the GDP, setting an ambition of net zero by 2050. But before 2050, many of those big dairy companies are setting targets for 2030, typically 30% reduction in carbon emissions by then. But how do you then get there? And they're very much looking for the complete program. Okay, what happens is, improvements in animal productivity, reduction of direct methane emissions, all the way through to improved reduction in loss and waste in the system, and very much depending on what type of product they are then processing, whether it's a liquid milk, cheese, or yogurt, what have you. You have different solutions to improve processing efficiency, and all of that combined, of course, gets them to where they need to get to in terms of producing products to the consumer that's low carbon or towards their net zero goals. So we talk to the value chain. Every value chain is different, and therefore you need to have a set of solutions that fits and is relevant to that value chain.
Do you think that our respective governments, understand the complex nature of this reduction in carbon that involves the whole of the chain, rather than just look at farmers or aquaculture in isolation?
That's a very good question. It is a very complex topic, of course, and but I think there's a general understanding that it is about the decarbonisation of the value chain, and there's multiple players in that. It's not just on the lap of one person or one part of that value chain. I think obviously, if you're looking upstream from a big CPG company, then about 70 to 80% of your carbon footprint is coming from your supply of animal protein. Okay, and that's normal for any business. It's your upstream suppliers that are your main carbon sources. So obviously, there's a lot of focus on how can we, on the one hand, understand what is the footprint of farming, and that is highly nuanced. There are some extremely low footprint producers of animal protein, and also quite the opposite. But you need to understand and measure and baseline where those producers are, and then bring forward solutions that fit or improve that footprint. So by using really advanced footprinting technologies, full life cycle assessment, you get to understand exactly what's going on the farm, where to make improvements and how to make those improvements using proven technologies. And then most importantly, that are easy to implement. It does not result in a major capital expense for the farmer, for example. And they themselves have a positive return on investment for the farmer, improving productivity, for example. And so you get that win-win.
As a sustainability vice president, do you connect with people outside your organization? By that I mean outside your customer base. I mean, is there, for example, would you have been at COP26 if it was appropriate, or do you have similar meetings or groups or activities where you can exchange these views?
Yeah, of course. Again, taking a complete ecosystem approach to this, then you need to be meeting with various stakeholders. You get outside of your immediate industry. So you'll see the increasing focus from the financial institutions, for example, on where is the climate-related risk. The banks are very interested in understanding what is that risk on their balance sheets. The insurance companies are starting to look at what is insurable and what's too risky. You've got the ESG investors, the rise of the ESG investor groups, looking at where they place their money, wanting to understand what is the risk in farming and what is acceptable risk or not, who has plans in place, for example. But you also engage with NGOs as well, and other bodies. And I think it's really important that by doing that, you increase the awareness and understanding of the topic, that it is complex, that there isn't just this average kind of animal production concept around, and I think that's one thing the industry struggles with. Everybody's painted with the same brush, and it's not like that, and I think it's really important that we get those messages across, we get the facts across to all these different stakeholders, and that they really understand and appreciate what the industry is doing, actually.
And you mentioned there, which is interesting, and my next question about measurement. Before we can actually bring about change, we should measure where we are. Now, in sustainability terms, who's measuring what? Is this just down to the farm level measurements, or should everybody be measuring?
Well, ultimately, what you're doing is you want to measure the complete system, ideally. So if you're trying to measure what is the footprint of a kilo of meat, and that's the functional unit you're measuring, right? A kilo of meat, then you need to understand what are the inputs coming from the crops of the field, as I said before, how that's put into a ration, into feed, how the animal is consuming and digesting that and turning that into protein, what comes out in terms of manure. So everything in the farm. But then the animal leaves the farm, and that goes through the processing part of the chain, all the way down to packaging and onto the shelf. And so what we call the system boundaries go from one end right the way down to the other. And you need to be able to measure the whole process. And only by doing that can you really understand what's going on, where to make improvements, or where you don't need to make any improvements, because things may be really good. And then you have the complete view. And that's what's needed. And you need to do that in completeness. It's not just about carbon footprint, right? It's about the full environmental footprint. And typically we measure in 19 different dimensions, so you're covering the complete environmental footprint of that kilo of animal protein.
And do you think we're on target to meet our goals? The UK goals of zero emissions, but zero increase in our footprint by, is it 2050? Is that achievable in agriculture?
I think there can certainly be some major improvements made. The technologies are available in the industry, and they've been around, actually, some of these technologies for some time. I think the key thing, going back to measurement, is if you measure, then you'll understand exactly where you are. And then you can use these proven technologies to make significant reductions. We see double-digit reductions that are achievable in many of the animal protein supply chains. But of course, you can only do so much, and we firmly believe in reduce on your own in your own business, right? So you take the measures that make those structural changes that actually reduce your footprint. Measure that accurately, credible measurement, LCA tools. And then often you'll find in many industries, there's probably a gap to close, and it's maybe very difficult to close that gap. And that would then come down to buying, for example, in the case of carbon offsets, with a credible system, of course, to get down to net zero. Okay.
Net zero.
But I think the more we get into the detail, the more we see how nuanced this is, how some parts of the industry are already very well advanced, perhaps not recognized as much as they should be. Then I think there's a lot of positive notes we can take away here, but there's still quite a lot of work to be done.
David, we were speaking earlier on just briefly about COP26, and it reminds me that this is quite a significant event globally when it comes to we're not just talking about sustainability, but about climate change and reducing CO2 in the environment, etc. Did you have much involvement there, and did that have much significance to what you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Yeah, in fact, COP26 is a very important meeting, of course. And as a company, we were certainly present. And a very important point to discuss was the impact of methane emissions on climate change. And it's now well recognized. In fact, prior to the COP26, the most recent IPCC report highlighting the issue of methane emissions and that immediate action needs to be taken to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. And a major proportion of that is coming, of course, from livestock, from ruminants, from dairy and beef cattle. And it's an area that we as DSM have been working on for many, many years, and developed transformational innovation, which is called Bovaer, which reduces methane emissions from beef cattle by up to 90%, and a minimum of 30% in dairy cattle. Is receiving enormous attention from governments and industry worldwide. And when you start to see at COP26, over 100 countries, nations signing up to reducing methane emissions by 30% by 2030, then it's this type of technology that is really going to help that transition happen, bring it to reality. And I think it's good news for the dairy and the beef sector in that they can make a significant reduction in their carbon footprint. So it's an area which is something we've been very much involved in driving for many years. We also announced that we will be building more facilities up in Scotland for the production of Bovaer for the industry worldwide. So yeah, it was a very significant event for us as a company bring that technology to it.
And you mentioned Scotland, of course, but what other countries recognise the issue? Are you getting your message across to the dairy industry in all these other countries?
Yeah, we are. We're engaged with the dairy industry worldwide in all the significant dairying countries. But as you may be aware, the EU itself has a methane strategy in place and how to reduce methane. Likewise, the US. But countries that are majoring in ruminant business, whether it's dairy or beef, are very aware of the topic. And very much looking for solutions to make that reduction possible. And Bovaer is been recognised as a leading solution.
Fantastic!
And has a peer-reviewed research behind it, which elaborates on the topic.
Yeah. And did you find much recognition by the group itself when it comes to beef and dairy that a significant reduction can be achieved? I mean, did the whole COPE26 group understand what you're suggesting or what you're developing?
Yeah, I think there's a general acceptance that there are technologies now coming to the market to help this sector reduce its footprint, and many solutions coming, as I said, to the market, which have been reviewed by the scientific community. Bovaer have been highlighted as the leading one in that regard, in terms of consistently reducing methane emissions from dairy cattle and beef, with about up to 50 peer-reviewed publications, a lot of science behind it, and recognition worldwide by governments, the scientific community, and by the value chain as well. So it's well known, and now we're getting the registration is now coming into place. It's registered for use in Brazil and Chile, and EFSA in the European Union has just given a positive opinion about it. So we expect to have that available for the European market anytime soon. So it's really good news, I'd say, for this part of the industry.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you very much, David Nickell. It's great to have you on the Rongo Live video studio, and we look forward to welcoming you back when we've made greater progress in this direction. But good luck with we make it possible in 2022. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the anniversary of your first year of that program initiative. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Roger. A pleasure being here.
Bye for now.